Okay, so we are beginning our after lunch session, and to introduce herself, we have a wonderful speaker here.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Corina. I'm coming from Romania, where I do mostly automation work for the past 5 years or so. I've actually been doing testing for about 10 years, but Selenium and Java-based testing are my current focuses, and they have been for quite a while now. And I'm here today because I want to show you an approach that I find very, very useful when you're testing with Selenium, namely when you have to test a large chunk of content on your page and you don't want to just write a bunch of assertions to compare your expected values with your actual values that you get from the page. So I will show you an approach where you can create Java objects, simple objects, nothing fancy about them, and how you can use them to test pretty much everything that you have on your sites. Once you create an object, you can reuse that object to test similar components on all of the pages that you have. Yeah, first of all, if you want to follow my testing advice and so on, I have Twitter where I'm a little tester. I also have a blog about testing, so I will post there the slides and the code examples. I will also post in Git so that you can have a reference about what I'm talking about today. And what I'm going to do actually is going to be a task. So I've assigned myself a task for today by means of which I can actually show you the approach. And I'm going to demonstrate that, under an hour I can create some components that I can reuse across all of the tests that I will do from now on. And my task for today, it's a simple one because, we only have 40 minutes, so I could have done a much more complex example, but you will just see what it's about, and I can show you other places you can apply this approach. But my task for today is to on this page that you can see right here, I need to test that these three thingies with a colored background, which I call modules, I need to check that these three modules are the ones that you see here. So I need to check that the image that is displayed here is loading from the correct source. So I expect it to be loaded from specific source. So I expect a specific image to be there. I also expect these images to have a particular width and a particular height on inside the modules. And I don't know if you see the white, but there's also some text below the image modules, the image components there. So I want to check certain properties inside certain modules on a certain page. And I don't want to do this by using an assertion for all of these properties. So if I'm just referring to the first component here, I will call it the read component or reading component. I would actually want to test 4 things about this component. As I said, an image source, an image height, and an image width, but also the text that comes below them. Normally, if I would do this with the assertion approach, this would mean only 4 assertions for just this particular component, and then 4 assertions for the second one, and then 4 assertions for the other one. Now, this is a very simple example. Like, I could have a page where I have more than that. Maybe I have a link below this, and the link also has a label. It has a URL that has to open. It has a target, which specifies where to open that page, whether it's in the same browser or in another tab. But I don't want to use assertions. So I'm going to create objects based on what I see here. This approach that I'm going to show you means that instead of writing your classic assertions that are just extracting things from the page and they're comparing them with expected values, I will actually model what I see here into plain objects. I will look at the page and I will say, what do I see here? I see components, right? I name them, let's call them components or modules. Let's just say that they are components, right? I have three specific components here. The one with the blue background, the one with the red background, sorry, and the one with the turquoise background, right? So I have 3 modules here. And each of the modules have, let's say, 2 components inside them. Each of them has an image, and each of them has a text. Now, if we're thinking in Java, what is a text? The representation in Java for a text is nothing more than a string. So I can actually compare this text here with a string that I know its value for, right? So when I'm writing my tests, I know that this string is the one that I'm supposed to see on the page. But when it comes to the image, I don't have such a representation in Java, so I need to create one myself. So for this, I'm going to create a simple Java object that has only 3 properties because that is what I'm interested in today. I just want to test that this particular image comes from the source where I know I uploaded the image. I want to check that the width is correct, and I want to check that the height is correct. And because I'm interacting with the Selenium page, the width and the height, although when you're thinking about these measurements, you would say these are probably integers. Since I'm extracting them from the page, I will get them back via Selenium as strings. So I will just consider that my object has 3 properties, which are all strings, to simplify everything. So what I'm going to do is to create 2 objects today. I will create an image object, and I will create a modules object. And you will see exactly how I will use these to compare my expected values for the modules with what I see on the page. Okay? I will start off by creating a simple object here. And I will just say, from my ID, I will just say new Java class, and I will call it image, because I want to model an image. Okay? So I'm kind of mapping what I see on the page and what comes naturally to me when I look at the page into something that has an object-oriented representation. Okay? So I'm modeling it in Java. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I don't know how you see it in the back, but okay. So I'm just going to create an image. And as I said, if I'm looking at the page, my image has 3 properties that I'm interested in. The source, which I can determine by doing an inspection on the page. And I would say that for this particular image, you can see that it's highlighted here, I have a source attribute, a width attribute, and a height attribute. So I will create an object that has 3 properties, and I will call them, the first one is going to be a private string source. I will create a private string height, and a private string width. So I know that every time I'm going to test for an image, I will be interested in testing for these 3 properties. Of course, if you're looking on the internet, images have so many more properties these days. But for the purpose of my test, I'm just considering these 3 ones. I'm not interested in something else. Okay? Now, if I want to test an expected image versus an actual image, how am I going to do that? Well, since I've created an object, I have these so-called constructors. And I will define 2 constructors that I will use to create my expected image and my actual image. And what I will do is I will just do an assertion for the images. And all of the properties of the objects will be compared at the same time by using just one assertion. Let's start with the constructors, as I said. So I want to define my expected image. So if I'm looking at this page, I already know what this image is, right? I know where it's coming from, I know its size. So I want to create my expected image. I'm going to use a constructor for that. And since I already know the values, this constructor will just receive some strings that will be my expected values for the 3 properties that I defined for the object. And the thing is that I'm using my favorite IDE here, which is IntelliJ, and it's so helpful that it will create the constructor for me. I will just have to say, alt insert, generate the constructor. And because it knows what the properties for the object are here and that they are of type string, if I select constructor, I just need to select that I want all the 3 properties to be included when I generate the constructor, and the constructor magically appears there. So I don't have to do anything here, I just need to use a shortcut. So I already have a constructor that I can use to create all of my expected values for all of the images that I will ever use on my site. How I'm going to do that? Well, I have a separate class, which is the test class. So in this class, I've already done some some things that I didn't want to do here, like open the browser and just go navigate to the page where I want to do the testing. And I'll create a test here. But I want to first create my expected image value. And for that, I will just have to create a new, let's say I'm going to create a variable here inside my test. And I'm just going to call it an image, expected image. And I'm just going to call the constructor. And I'm going to say that my expected image has the following properties. I don't know if you can see, but here I have the suggestions for what are the 3 attributes that I want to pass in. So I want to pass in the expected source from where I'm loading the page. And for the sake of demo, I will just put in some very, very random string here. So I'm just going to say HTTP something. The next thing that I need to pass in is my expected height. And I'm just going to say that I expect this particular image to have a height of 200. And let's say that I also expect for it to have a width of 200. OK, so now I already have half of the problem solved. I know what I want to see on the page, but I need to compare it with something. I need to compare it with what is actually on that page. So for that, what would happen if I would do an assertion? I would just say assert equals the value in string with something that I'm extracting from the page, right? In this case, if I'm looking at the page, I'm going back to my HTML. I would just have to say that, for example, if I'm talking about the height, I would just say that based on the web element that represents the image, in my case, it has a very nice ID here, I will just have to say that for this particular element, I will have to get the attribute of height or width depending on what I'm doing. So I'm going to create another constructor. This one I will have to actually do manually because this is some very, very specific logic that I want to implement. So I'm just going to create the constructor that will get me the actual values for this parameter, for these parameters by going to the page and extracting them from there. All I'm going to need in this case is to just provide the web element that represents my image. I'm just going to say web element. And when I'm going to run the test for the first module, this web element that I will pass in will be the one that has the ID of this image, and namely reading module image. Right? So if I'm going to pass in, if I want to pass in this web element, I will just have to extract all the values that I'm interested in from this object. So here I'm just going to say that if I want to create the first one was the source, right? So if I want to read the property from the page, which is the source, I will just have to say that based on the web element, I just have to find the get attribute named source, because that's its representation in the HTML, and this is it. So I'm now going to have the value for where the image is currently loading on a page. Now if I want to see the height, it's something similar, because in this case I just have a simple image element and all of the attributes that I want to read from the page are stored on that element. So I don't need to do any more logic in there. It's quite a simple thing. It's just a it's an HTML entry. So I'm just going to say this dot height is element get attribute height. So now I will know that when I'm creating this object, the test that I'm going to create will just go to the page and it will get the height attribute from the web element that I'm passing in. I will show you exactly the values that are read, and I will show you how the assertions are done. So currently I'm just going to focus on creating this constructor. Similarly, the width is on the same element. I just have to get the attribute named width. And now I'm done. I've already created the constructor for the actual values of the attributes of this object. So now I can use this constructor whenever I want to read the properties of an image from any of my sites. I just need to pass in the web element that identifies that particular image. Now, we are talking about objects. So when we are using this approach, the object-oriented Selenium approach, we need to define 5 things. The properties, which we already did. So these are the source, the height, and the width. The constructor for the expected values, in which we will explicitly pass in the values that we expect to see on the page, and the constructor for the actual values. But because we're dealing with objects and this is pure Java behind it, we also need to create some other things. Namely, I need to create, and again, IntelliJ is going to help me to do all this part. In order to compare the two objects, I always have to create their specific equals and hash code methods, because this is how comparison is done between the values of two objects. Otherwise, if you're doing the comparison, if I would just create two objects right now, if I would compare them, not their values would be those that will be compared, but some reference to them. And you don't want that. You want to compare each of these values. So I will just have to go to my IntelliJ and say, create me the equals and hashcode methods so that I don't bother with doing this. And I just have to, go next, next, next in these screens. And by the time I'm done, I've already automatically generated 2 methods that are used for comparing the 2 objects. This is the 4th thing that I need to do, so create the equals and hashcode. And there's another thing that I need to create, which is the toString method, so that I can actually, when I need to print them to the console or when the comparison is made, you actually see what are all those properties and how their values are compared. I will show you what this is useful for a bit later, but I'm just going to create the toString method now. Again, from my ID, it is created automatically. I don't have to bother with it. So all that this does is going to print my source, height, and width values for my expected and for my actual object. Now, I created the object. This is everything that I need in order to start doing the comparison. So I will start by doing the test for the first image that I saw here. So this flower. Initially, I created my expected image. So I'm thinking that it should be loaded from a particular web page and that it should have a particular size. Now, I want to see before I do the actual comparison, I just want to show you what it looks like if you're just calling the constructor for the actual values. I'm just going to do a system out for you to see the values in the console. So I'm just going to do a system out and I'm going to call the constructor that I created based on the web element. And normally I would have to pass in so the web element represented by this ID. I'm not going to write it again because I've already created it. So I have a separate class. It's called modules page. And here I've already written the selectors for all of the web elements that I'm using in this page, so I don't have to write them again. So just know that when I'm going to call the reading module image element, I've already created it based on its ID. So now I'm just going to create my expected values for the first image on the page. Yeah, it's private, yeah. Never build a constructor privately. Yeah, now it's gonna work. So, for the sake of this test, everything that will happen is that you will see something in the console. You will see the values that are read from the page. Okay, so my test will open the page. And in my case, I don't have to do any more processing in order to get to what I want to test. I just open the page and I see the layout there. There might be other times when there's something more complex going on between when you start the test and the point where you actually want to test for the properties. Those are not part of this approach. This approach only says once you have gotten to the point where you want to test for some content, then use these constructors and generate the actual values and compare them with your expected ones. Okay. Now the test ran, and it actually provided me some values. I'm trying to scroll here. So this is what it read from the page. It read an image object whose source is something from Flickr. This is the URL of the image that is in the first module there. And it read that the height and the width are both 1 to 5. Okay. I can do the same, and maybe I want to read. Let's do an example. Let's read all of the properties of all of the images on this page, just to see how they are displayed. As I said, I've already created some web elements for all of them, so I'm just going to duplicate this really fast. And the second image is something like travel image, and the third one is something like photo. Okay. So now I'm just going to have 3 system outs. So again, the page will open, and the constructors will be called. And the constructors will go to the page, and they will extract all the values from there, all you need to do is just pass in the web element. Now, in some particular cases, like I'm going to show you how we are going to test the whole module, maybe not all of the things that you want to test from the page are accessible via just one web element. Maybe you need to pass in like 5 web elements. And maybe, a property comes from one of them, another property comes from another one, and so on. When you're creating the constructor, keep in mind that you want to have its signature as small as possible. You don't want to pass in a ton of things. You don't want to pass in all of the web elements, but instead try to put all the logic inside the test. So when you need to extract based on a web element, maybe just provide a top level web element, and based on that do some relative finding inside the constructor. Basically, do all the processing that you need inside the constructor, otherwise you're going to just have a very, very large signature to your constructors, and if you're building objects inside objects inside objects, calling those constructors will just take like 100 parameters, and that's going to be very difficult to read. Okay, so now this finished loading, and as you can see, 3 URLs were read, and the height and width for all of the images is the same. Just to make sure that that's the way it happens, I can click on the first one, and you'll see that this is the image that appeared in my first module here. Okay? We print it out, that's fine. But now we actually want to test these. So I'm going to just do an assert equals and nothing else for the first image. I've already created the expected value, and now I'm able to call the constructor for the actual value. And I'm going to just drop these, and I'm just going to replace the system out with an assert equals. And this is the test-ng assert equals in my case. Okay, and I just need to pass in the 2 parameters that I want to compare. The actual image, which is this, which is being read from the page, and the one that I just created here, my expected one. And I'm just going to say assert equals the 2 of them. And now I'm going to run the test, and we'll see what happens. It will fail, because the values that I provided for my expected image were dummy ones. So in this comparison, each of the properties will be compared between the actual and the expected objects, and all of the inconsistencies will be thrown out at once. So with this approach, if you have to test, like if you have an object that has 10 properties, the assert equals will compare all of the 10 properties at once. You don't have to write 10 assertions for that. All of the values that are inconsistent will be displayed to you so that you understand where your failure actually comes from. Okay, there's a slight Wi-Fi problem, so it's gonna load a bit slower. Okay. Okay, so the test just tries to wait for the page to load, and then it will just do the comparison. Okay, so we have a failure. I'm trying to make this a little bit bigger so that you can actually see where the failure is and what the output looks like. So, in my console, because I wrote the assert equals, the first thing that I will see is that I have an assertion error. I expected an image with certain properties, but I found something else. And here, I also have the expected and the actual values, like one below the other, so that you can actually see the different properties that are being compared. But if it's not very clear from this screen, you can just click on the click to see difference icon. Again, this is only in IntelliJ. I'm not sure how it looks like in Eclipse, for example. But here, it's very nicely highlighted. So here it says that what you have with a darker color are all of the mismatches that occurred between the expected and the actual values for the image. So the source was wrong, definitely. I just put in something dummy. The height was wrong. I expected 200, but in fact, it was 125. And the width the same. I expected 200, but it was 125. Now, I'm just going to show you what it looks like if I put in the correct values. I'm cheating a little bit here. I'm just going to fill in these with the values that are actually on the page. So I'm just going to put 1 to 5 and 1 to 5. And now when I'm going to do the comparison, the test will pass, because all of the values that I expected to see there will be the correct ones. So again, I'm loading at the page and I'm just reading the properties. And I can do the same for the second image and the third image. Basically, once I created an image object, I can use it to test everything that I want on my whole site. Everywhere that I need to test for these 3 properties for an image, instead of doing those many assertions, I can just create the expected values by calling the constructor with explicit parameters, so with all the strings there. And I would just have to do an assert equals and compare those values with what I'm reading from the page, for which I already have the constructor. I just need to pass in the web element. And it's that simple. Now I can test all of the images that I have anywhere on the site. Of course, I'm testing sizes. So for example, if my image was larger, I could still apply this. I just have to put in some other values for the height and width parameter. And now the test has passed. So I have a green here, so it means that the values that I expected were the ones that I saw on the page. Okay? This is nice. So I've already created the image. Now I can test all the images. But my initial task was to actually test the first module here. So this module is not only an image, it also has a text here. And the text is just a string, so I don't need to create a separate object for the string. But I need to create an object called module. And this module will have 2 properties. It will have an image and a string. So this is going to be quite easy. Similar to what I did for the image, I would just say create a new object named module. So this is a new class in which I have to put in the 2 properties. And I'll just say that I want an image and I want a string. And I'm just going to call it text. So the text that is displayed beneath the image. I have to create a constructor for it. So I'm just going to say, again, automatically generate the constructor for my expected values. So here I will have to pass in my expected image, which is an object. So I can already create an object because I already have the constructor, and a string. After that, I will just have to create a new constructor for my actual values, and this will be based on a web element. And in my case, what I'm going to do is that this constructor will always, so in order to create the image, I will have to call the constructor for the image. So I'm going to say new image. And now I'm creating the actual values. So I'm going to call the actual image constructor. And I will have to pass in a web element to it. But in order to simplify things, as I said, here I will just pass in a top-level web element. And in my case, it's going to be the web element of the whole container for the 2 things that I see here. And it has this ID. It's the reading module ID. And relative to that, I will find where my image is. So I will just pass in, I'm considering that the element here, as I will call it in my test, is going to be the top-level element. And I will have to find the I'm doing a find element by CSS selector. And in my case, because the page is very, very simple, identifying the first image here is just with this tag. So I need to find the first img element that comes right after the web element that I passed in. So I'm just going to say find the first image that you see. And based on that, extract the source, the height, and the width. And then this text is just going to be find, again, based on the web element that I'm providing for the constructor, I'm going to say find the first, and I'm going to look into the page, and the page says find the h2 that comes right after the top level element. Find the h2 and just get the text for it, because that's how I'm going to get the text that I see there. And of course, I have to say by CSS selector. So now I have the expected constructor for the module. Again, I have to define automatically two more things, the equals and hash code, which just next, 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 and the toString. And now I have the module complete. And now all I have to do is just, create an expected module. Let's say that I'm creating my expected here. I'm going to say module expected module. And here, I will say a new module. I'm calling the constructor for the expected ones. And I will just pass in the expected image because I've already created it. So I expect this to be the image that I will see. And I will just put in some random string that I want to see there. Random string. Okay? So now I've constructed my expected module, which has 4 properties in total, if you're thinking about it. It has the 3 that comes from the image, that come from the image, and the 4th one, which is specific to the module, and it's this text that is right below here. Okay. I want to do the assertion to see if, the values that I want to see on the page are correct. So for that, I will just call the assert equals. And I will have to just compare my actual module. And that is going to be a call to the constructor with the web element. And in my case, the web element is just going to be the web element for the container of the whole thing. And I will just compare it with the expected module that I defined here. Okay? So as I said, in this case, 4 properties are compared one by one. Each of the values that fail will be displayed to the console. Now, in my case, I expect to see only one failure here. Just going to comment this out. So again, I'm loading the page, and I'm just looking at the first module. And I'm reading all of the 4 properties from this. Okay, so I have a failure. Why did it fail? Well, sorry? Oh. Okay, so as I said here, you kind of see what's happening, but it's easier to look at the differences with this view. So if you're scrolling to the right, you can see that the module now has a property that is called image, and that image has the source, which is correct right now because I created the correct expected image. It has a height which is correct, a width which is correct, and then the text is failing because the expected text is not the one that is actually on the page. So let's do another demo. I will just modify the I will modify this image, and I will just do something here. And if I'm going to run the test again, then I will see 2 parameters that have failed the comparison. Okay, out of the 4 that I defined. Again, I'm loading the page, and based upon page load, I will see exactly where the failure occurred. So as I said, this is an easier example. So I just had an object in which I defined another object and the text. But in real life, I will show you something that I did at a workshop. So I had a 2-hour workshop where you had to test way more properties than this. And some of the things that I defined here can be applied there because I have an image, and I had an image there too. But that was way more complex because the modules that we were testing had an image with 3 properties, but also it had a link on it. Then it had some categories which had a label and a URL and so on. So that takes a bit more time because you need to create a bit more objects, but once you create an object, you can reuse it in all your tests. And sometimes the values that you create for, I don't know, they can be reused across pages. For example, if you're thinking that you have a footer, and the footer has some links there. Once you create let's say that you have some common links across several pages, but they are not identical on all of the pages. Once you create an expected link from your footer, you can reuse that to compare against links on other pages if you're using that on other pages, if that makes sense. So once you create an object, you can reuse it to create as many objects as you want, and some of them you can actually, the values for them you can actually reuse later on. Okay, so in this case I had another failure. And as you can see here, I failed for the source of the image. And then I failed only at the text, because the text wasn't the one that I expected. So once I will, figure out if it was a bug on the site or if it was something on my behalf, I will just modify the values, and then my assertions would pass. So the benefit for doing this is basically you're modeling what you're seeing on the page into something that has more meaning than your assertions, because if you're going to look at the objects, all of the properties there have a meaning, right? You have the source, you have the height. Otherwise, if you're just doing a bunch of assertions, they don't really tell you anything. When you're looking at 10 assertions in a test, when you're searching for something in particular, it's quite difficult to pinpoint what that is in that whole bunch of stuff there. So this is a bit of a cleaner approach. And it's also very easy to use, because creating an object doesn't take more than maybe 10 minutes if it's very, very complex, if you're struggling to extract the values from the page. But once you created one, you can just reuse them, and that's the whole beauty of it. Just keep in mind that if you're creating them, the parameters that you will pass in, and now I'm talking about the values for the constructor for the actual module. If I would have passed in many, many other parameters, and I would build another object that builds upon this, it would be very, very difficult to maintain. So basically, do as much processing as you can inside the constructor, and just make the calls to the constructor really, really simple. Because then you can just have very short tests. When you're looking at the test here, this is a part of it, and this is a part of it. Well, of course, I could just create a module here inside the assert equals if I'm not using it. But apart from that, it looks much nicer, it's cleaner, and anybody who's looking at your test can then understand, what did I mean with this module? What did I mean with this image? What were the properties I was interested in? And anybody can just create these tests, and trust me, if you're doing something very complex, like I will show you, like testing these things, then this is really, really helpful, because here, if you're looking at this, as I said, this is an image with the source, height, width, but also a text attached to it. A URL that opens attached to it. Then I have some tags here, which are clickable, which are a label and a URL. Then here it's the same, a label and a URL, and so on. So it's very, very difficult to just do assertions after assertions. And the beauty is that once I created the image, I can test this image, this image, this image, and then everything else I have here. This image, this image, this image, and so on. So basically, you're using something that you build once. You can just spend 5 minutes or an hour, depending on how complex that is, but you can reuse it across all of the tests that you have. So it's much, much easier and much prettier to do, from my perspective. Okay, I think that's about it from me.